Thanks everyone for coming today to hopefully a fun presentation, especially because it's close to the end of the day on Friday and you decide to come to a talk about spreadsheets. So what could be funner than that? If you want to follow along this presentation, there's a bit.ly link and it'll be at the end of the presentation as well, bit.ly nerds21magic. So you can check out this presentation there. So just one warning for everybody out there, if you haven't yet noticed, this presentation is just one big Google spreadsheet. I figured if we're going to show you how to make magic with Google spreadsheets, I should build the presentation in Google spreadsheets. So every slide is a different sheet, just with a lot of conditional formatting, which if you make a copy of this spreadsheet yourself, you can turn off the conditional formatting and see some of the magic I've worked into this presentation. So I'll turn it on just for, it looks a lot better with it on. So yeah, hi, a little bit about myself. I'm Mike Miles. There's a picture of me if you can't see me in the chat or in the Zoom. You can find me all over the internet, Mike Miles 86. I'm a developer. I don't know what else you might want to know about me. I've been to Nerd Summit many times and it's one of my favorite conferences. During the day, I am the I am the director of web development at MIT Sloan. So I'm in charge of all our digital public-facing web properties and the development team that manages them. So part of my job is writing code and the other part of it is managing a lot of spreadsheets to keep track of things. I also have a podcast called Developing Up, which is focused on the non-technical side of being a developer. So anything that's related to having a career in development that's not specific for writing code is what we talk about in the podcast. So you can find that at DevUp Podcast. And the last thing about me, if you haven't been able to tell yet, I love spreadsheets. I use them all the time professionally and personally. I use a spreadsheet to keep track of the books I read. I used to use it to track when I had multiple methods for actually going into the office, keeping metrics on which method was the fastest so I would know. And then for work purposes, keeping track of sprint progress, budgeting, of course, for spreadsheets. But anything where I need to collect data, I'm usually going to Google and I'm creating a spreadsheet for it. And I think there's a lot of ways to use spreadsheets and a lot of value you can deliver when you collect data into a spreadsheet and present it to people. So when I say making a magic with spreadsheets, what do I mean? I mean presenting your data in a way that makes it meaningful and engaging to the audience that you're presenting it to. And that audience could be yourself. That audience could be your team. It could be a client. It could be your manager. Whoever you're building it for, you want to make sure that if you're collecting the data in a spreadsheet, and it may look something like this, where this is collecting some sort of information, which is great for a spreadsheet, it's not really meaningful or engaging. And instead, you can work some magic to make it look nicer. And here's just a small example of what I would consider more of a magical spreadsheet. It has naming that makes sense. People can look at it and understand what they're looking at, and from that derive some sort of meaning and usefulness. A bigger example of this would be like, for example, an overview of how a development team sprint is going, or their sprint history and their velocity. So just a quick note, all the data you're going to see in this presentation is also real data. These are not screenshots. This is not static information. They're all tied to some example spreadsheets that I have at the end of this presentation. So if we make a change to that data, it will change here. So this is all live. I would never try to fool you with anything. So having something like this can be really helpful for a number of different people. And again, throughout this presentation, I'm going to use an example here. If you look down at the bottom of my screen, I have all these different tabs, and at the back, I have these blue ones. And this example spreadsheet that you'll have access to is based off a structure I use for actually keeping track of my team's sprint velocity and sprint performance. So there's a summary, there's a sprint log of who's assigned to what work, there's a log of the sprints, of all our tickets that we're working on, of the team progress, tickets statuses and priorities and whatnot. And organizing all these into ways that make sense and is meaningful has a lot of usefulness to myself and my team. So how do you do this? How do you go ahead and make a spreadsheet magic? I think it's first understanding your audience, knowing who you're who you're collecting the data for really helps drive how you're going to present it to them and what you're going to do with that data. then it's thinking of it as a magic trick. And I like to break a magic trick down into 3 parts, something I learned from Michael Caine in the movie The Prestige, where it's about dueling magicians, and Michael Caine breaks down the 3 parts of a magic trick, which is thus. First, there's the pledge. This is where a magician shows you something ordinary that you understand. For a spreadsheet, this is showing your audience the data in a way that they can understand what they're looking at. Then there's the turn, where the magician makes that normal everyday thing do something extraordinary. They pull a rabbit out of a hat, they make a car disappear, they cut someone in half. For your spreadsheets, the turn is where you take that static data you're collecting and you make it do something dynamic. You make it a little bit engaging. Then there's the prestige. This is where the magician takes that extraordinary thing and does something else with it. So they put the person back together, they turn the rabbit into a bunch of doves, they make the car reappear at another place on the stage. For your spreadsheet, this is making your data memorable and your spreadsheet useful enough that people want to keep coming back to it and using it and engaging with it. I think overall, it's about thinking through how you're going to take your data that you're collecting and make it tell a meaningful story to your audience so that they want to use that data and it delivers some sort of value. So the rest of this talk is breaking down a spreadsheet into these 3 parts of the magic trick: how you plan out what audience you're going to build to, how you're going to structure it in the pledge, how you're going to make it dynamic in the turn, and then how you're going to make them keep coming back in your prestige. I know it's kind of a stretch of it's kind of a stretch to link it to a magic trick, but I think hopefully it works. Okay, so asking the right questions is how you understand who your audience is. And when you create a spreadsheet, you may have multiple audiences. And it all depends on how they want to use the data and what they want to see, what they want to care about. So again, it may be yourself. You're collecting information just for yourself. And what do you care about? You care about collecting all the data. So you may not have to make that part as magical. But you may have your development team. What do they care about? What do they want to know from the data you're collecting for like your sprints, or your client again, or your project manager? When you can think about who you're going to present this data to and think about, well, what of this data they care about, then you can start to think about how will you show that to them? How will you highlight what they care about so that they can quickly pick it out from all the data you're collecting in your spreadsheet? So for example, right, the development team, in terms of an example of keeping track of sprint progress, they want to know ticket assignments and story points so they can make improved estimates in future grooming sessions. They probably want to see a table of the sprint ticket work and maybe a calculation of team averages so they know how fast they're working, their velocity, so they can help make that sort of those estimates. A project manager may want to know overall the team's velocity, so they're aware of when a milestone will be met or when it might not be in danger of being met, so they can quickly inform the client or get more resources. And obviously they'd find it probably helpful if they could use this data to calculate project timelines and ticket estimates based on historical data. Or your client, they may care about for sprint data in a spreadsheet that they want to know just real quickly how work is progressing. They don't have a lot of time to look through your data, so they need something quick and visual that they can see. So how would you show that to them if you're collecting that data? So the first part, again, of making a spreadsheet magical is the pledge, turning it into something ordinary. And this is all about directing your audience's attention to data that's important and doing so in a straightforward way. The first part of this is organizing your data into columns and rows. And I think this probably seems a little redundant in talking about spreadsheets because that's how they're organized. But I think it's the way you utilize columns and rows and organize your data makes a big impact just initially on how people find the usefulness of your spreadsheets. So using columns for the different categories of data is the most helpful I've found in the past. So having a start date go down in this column, end date in the next column, working days in the next column, etc. It's easier to add columns from left to right in a spreadsheet in all the major spreadsheet applications than it is to add them as rows. And doing so allows you to then use your rows for adding the actual data. So you're probably going to be adding more data than you are columns. And a lot of the built-in functions and formulas are based on this fact that your rows contain data and your columns contain the different categories. And you want to think about how you're going to group your rows and columns together in a meaningful way. As a developer, I kind of think of this as like this is sort of like database architecture, or it's sort of like information architecture, right? Here I have a little table of sprint information: start date, end date, the days in the sprint, the number of releases, the ticket count. And here I have ticket information. So it makes sense to have these in separate groups. If I had these all together going across in just columns, it would make me have to duplicate a lot of data or leave a lot of blank space and make it harder for someone to understand. So by grouping these together in columns and rows that make sense, that initially helps people understand what they're looking at. Now, the next part of that is to then split your data across multiple sheets. I see a lot of times when people create spreadsheets, they just click the little create a sheet button and they use the one sheet that's provided to them. And the problem with this is that it makes it harder to keep your data up to date as you're moving a lot of things around, but it also makes it harder for someone to understand where they're supposed to pay attention to the spreadsheet. So not everything needs to be on the same sheet. If you follow my mouse down the lower left corner, there's a plus button here. I can add a sheet just as easily as pressing that button and move or store some data specific to that one sheet. The value of this as well is you can create sheets for different audiences. So now in our little styling here, I have all of a sudden 4 sheets. On sheet 2 is just my sprint information. And now this doesn't look that great, but maybe I'm the only one who's going to keep track of this data and look at it. I don't need it to look as great as the summary page may look. I don't need it to look as functional as the ticket information may look. But my client may look at the summary page. So I want to spend a lot of time on how I conditionally format that and make it look nice. And in addition, you can change the labels of the sheets. So now here in this little example, instead of sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, sheet 4, it's summary, sprints, tickets, team. This makes it already easy for someone to navigate and understand what's on each tab. You'll notice this whole presentation is just a series of sheets, and each sheet has the title of the quote unquote slide. So for example, this is called the pledge. And I can just click on this arrow and I can say rename, and I can name it to whatever I want. It won't let me name it the same name as another sheet, but I can change its name to something meaningful. And the last part of the pledge is to add some basic formatting to your data in your spreadsheet. I think first and foremost, it's important to highlight headers and make them a different style than the data. It just helps people understand what they're looking at and separates the titles from the information itself. So here we've created a cell that goes across these subheaders called sprint details. And then we have these here. And these I could probably name better, like it'd be start day, end day, working days, ticket count, for example. But already just having the sprint header here on the sprints tab, I think provides a lot of useful information and really familiarizes the user with this data. For long sheets, you want to freeze the headers, and I'll show you this in a moment. That way, as someone's scrolling through your information in the data on your spreadsheet, they don't forget what each column means. And then I would say remove the columns and rows that you don't need. When you create a new sheet in Google Spreadsheets, when you click that little add sheet button, it has 26 columns and 1,000 rows. That's a lot of extra space that you may not need. So you'll actually, if you were paying attention, you'll see here in this little example, I have just 3 columns here. In the previous tabs, I had like 10, right? This is a lot of wasted space, and it's not causing any problems, but it will distract from the telling the user where to look, the audience member where to pay attention to. So by removing those, it really focuses their attention. And then use groups to show and hide data. So if you're collecting data for a long time and you have historical information that you need for calculations, but people don't really want to look at anymore, use a grouping to hide that. So all these actual bullet points in this presentation are groups that I can expand and hide. So that makes it, as we pass by these and finish these points, I can hide them and we don't need to look at them anymore. And that's as easy as selecting the rows or columns that you want to group, right-clicking and saying group the rows. And that creates this little group here, and I can collapse that or I can show it. And I can remove this group as well. So let's take a look at the example spreadsheet. We're going to look at the sprint log. So this sheet here keeps track of the sprint name, the ticket assignment, and who on the team it's assigned for. So let's see, I have groups here for some of the older sprints like sprint alpha, sprint beta, Sprint Charlie. And as I scroll through, I have those frozen headers so that I can always know that column A is the sprint name, column B is the ticket, and column C is the assignee. And you'll see I don't have any other columns because I've deleted them. So it really focuses the attention on just this part of the spreadsheet. So now that we have some data normalized so that someone looking at it can understand and feel familiar with the data they're looking at, you want to do the turn. You want to do something extraordinary with it. So this is impressing your audience by making your static data dynamic, making it transform itself in some sort of useful way. Now, the easiest way to do this in spreadsheets is using functions. And I'm going to use some audience participation for this part. So I'm going to bring up the chat screen, and I need people to say, I need 5 words, please. I need people in chat to type out a word, and I'll add it to this spreadsheet to show you some magic. Oh, spatula. Go. 3 more words. Ooh, lighthouse. Burrito. And whisk. All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. So this also shows that I didn't have anything planned. This is not a planned list of words that anybody fed to me. This is all live data. So thank you for that. So as you might have noticed, as I added words here, some other values showed up on the spreadsheet. So some of the things you can do with functions to make dynamic data is basic math using cell references. So this average size here, this calculates the average size of the words in the word bank, and it says it's 6 characters long. And this is taking basically, let's see if I can highlight it here. It says it's taking cell AS24 and dividing it by AS23, which you can see that here. So that's the total characters divided by the total number of words. So if I deleted whisk, that would change. You can do complex calculations using built-in functions such as if, count, sum, count if. For example, here, the total characters is the sum of a range of cells. So I'm saying, give me the sum of cells AR16 to AU20, which is this here. I'm using count if to tell me how many cells within this range have a value and they're not blank. So that's giving me the total words. So these are using built-in functions, and you can combine these functions in complex ways. And if you're doing that, you start to use some more complex functions. If you start doing complex calculations for whatever you might need to do, just think about performance and how you want your spreadsheet to work well, because it does a lot of client-side processing. And so if you have a very complex formula, try to put that in one single place and then reference it. So for example, each one of these words in our word bank says what percentage of the total characters it is. So spatula is 23% of all the characters in our word bank. And I did that by just dividing the length by the total characters. So I could have just said, divide AR16 by AS20, or by the sum of this range every time, and duplicated the sum function. But instead, since I have it here, I just make a reference to the cell that has the total in it. Speaking of referencing functions, it's probably best to reference data as often as you can to prevent duplication errors. Now, you can reference things from other sheets or from the same sheet from different cells using different methods. If you're referencing from a different sheet, you just put in the sheet name. If there's a space, you put single quotes around it with an exclamation point. So for example, this title here, this has a reference to the turn sheet, which is actually this sheet, to cell AM14. So I'll show you that. So this says word bank. If I change this here, we'll say it's the word library. Oops. I update that there and I collapse this now this says word library. By referencing data like headers across multiple sheets, keeping things in sync, that just aids and helps people pay attention and know what they're looking at. It adds consistency. You can also use referencing of data to provide users with options in a valid way where they can't screw things up. So here we have a select minimum length, and I can select a number to find the length of word from our word bank that has at least that number of characters in it. And this validation here is from doing data validation, and I can tell it, give me a list from a range of cells, or I can give it a hard-coded list of items. By doing it this way, again, it adds consistency, and it makes it so that I don't have to rely on someone putting in a number in here directly and returning 0 results, for example. And finally, you can use filtering, you can use array formula, or you can use curly brackets to include a range of values from a cell, from a sheet, or from other sheets. So this word library here uses a filter function to say, give me the words from this range of cells, AM16 to AM20, where the character length from the character row or the character column is equal to or greater than what I've selected in this value here. So using filtering in brackets, I can, in sometimes complex ways, filter values from another sheet or from another section of the sheet, so I don't have to duplicate it myself. And that just makes that a little more magical where you need to do that. And finally, do dynamic highlighting using conditional formatting. Highlight what's important to the people who are looking at your data. Again, think about your audience and what they care about. This helps draw attention to the very most important pieces of data in a set and what they care about. So there's a number of ways to do this. You could do simple conditioning based on a cell's value. So for example, if I highlight this range of cells and I'm going to go up to format, conditional formatting. Now, I already have some formatting rules just for my presentation, but if I add another rule, it has that range of cells highlighted. You'll see by default it says it's not empty, and it gives it some styling. But I could say, if this value is greater than, we'll say, since this is a percentage, 0.25%, then highlight it there. So I'm using the value in this cell to determine if it's highlighted. So if we change these words and these values change, which one is highlighted gets changed. So I can say 0.2, I'll have these other ones highlighted. But you can also highlight in conditional format based off of other cell values. So here I have a find word function, and if I select a word from here, it's going to highlight in this range. So the way I did that is just by highlighting this and looking at this custom formula. We'll see it's comparing the value of the cell from this range and seeing if it matches the value in this other cell. So that's a way where you can quickly highlight people, you can highlight sprints, you can highlight information and give people options to do so. Downside of conditional formatting, which you can use for a lot of things, you can't format borders for some reason. So if you put cell borders on something, you can't conditionally turn those on or off. Why that's not a thing, I don't know. I wish it was, but that's a limitation. So for example of taking some static data and making it dynamic and useful, let's look at this example team sheet. So this sheet shows a development team and the work they've been doing on their sprints. And you can see some green highlighting here. So for example, we highlight, David has the most assigned tickets, but Ben has the most highest percentage of completed tickets. David gets the highest number of assigned points, but Ben completes the most points during a sprint. But Carrie actually has the only one who's completed 100% of her story points. We can see who has the fastest dev time and the most points per sprint. So just, these are things that might be important to someone in this situation, and think through your data about what might be important to somebody to highlight. And again, to prove that this is live data, let me go to the sprint log and I'll change, let's see, we'll change something, we'll take something off of David and put it on Ben. And if I go back to this team here, you'll see now Ben has all the highlighting and David only has one. All right, so now we come to the prestige. This is where you want to take your data and make it memorable. You want to keep people coming back to your spreadsheet, hopefully, to use it. Now, there may be instances where you're building spreadsheets for one-off uses, so you probably don't follow all this to do that. But if you want to build something that people want useful, you want to make it memorable and helpful. So provide a helpful overview. If you're collecting a lot of data, this could be providing a summary sheet. This could just be providing on your sheet averages or some sort of high-level metric that people are going to want to look at so they can get a quick overview of the information you're providing them. You can provide a basic review of important data. So on a summary sheet, for example, we could have all the averages from the sprints, like the working days, the average number of releases, or averages for tickets. That would be helpful in ticket grooming, for example, or the averages of team members and like how much work they can handle per sprint. This basic information gives someone a Scrum Master quick info they need. So on your spreadsheet, think about what overview you want to provide someone so they don't have to dive deep into the data unless they really need to. And if they need to, what's great is you can link to other sheets. So by just highlighting, let's see, I will highlight, I don't know, tickets per sprint, right? And I may want to link that to the sprints sheet. So I can just click on the link tab here, and I can look for the sheets in this spreadsheet, and I can select which one I want it to link to. So this way, if someone looks at this high level details and they're like, oh, I want to know more about this, they can quickly go to it. They don't have to think about navigating on your well-labeled sheets. I think another useful thing is to use your data in an active way to make it a helpful tool for someone to use. And that makes it really magical if they can do something with it to get their own information and draw their own conclusions. So you can use metrics as a calculator to calculate predictions and estimates. There's a number of ways you can do this. For example, you could build a ticket estimator in our sprint spreadsheet. And you can say, all right, if I'm going to create a ticket today, we can estimate based on the averages, like, well, in general, we think this ticket would take 5 days, not knowing anything else about it. It would go in the sprint on April 1st. It would be done by April 6th. But we could change that because we're keeping metrics and data about sprint priorities, which I can show you. Like if it was a trivial ticket, it's going to take longer because we don't care about trivial tickets. If it's a critical ticket, it's going to be done faster. Or, you know, if we think about who could we assign to this based on how fast they work, we could throw some estimates out there. So you could think about this in terms like building project estimates, or even just providing yourself based on historical data, what future might look like for any sort of information. I use it on my personal book tracker. When I put a book in, I say how many pages it is, and it uses my historical data of how long it takes me to read a book to tell me when it thinks I had finished the book. That doesn't really do anything, but it's fun to see, and it's helpful to me. You can also lock sensitive data from unauthorized access so that you don't have to worry about if someone is actively using your tool, they're not going to break it. So you can highlight a row of cells, a range of cells, and you can say, protect this range. And you can set permissions so that you can say, for example, only I can edit this range, or I can add myself and a couple other people to protect this range to use this, to edit this data. But you can also do that on sheets as a whole. So if I wanted to say, you know, the only person who should be adding in tickets into our ticket sheet is myself and the Scrum Master. So I can say protect this whole sheet, and I can say set the permissions, and only who can edit this sheet is a certain person. And then finally, you want to do your best to hide your errors, I would say. That just, you know, if you make a mistake when you're performing a magic trick, you don't want to call attention to it. You want to hide your errors. So here, for example, this gives an estimate of when this estimated ticket could go into a sprint, but there's no sprint that matches this date. So it says NA. So this uses a filter, but I could add an if error statement here. Then I could just say what it should happen if there's an error. So I'll say none. Oops. If error, I have to spell it correctly. Great. So now we'll say if there's an error, I'll say none. So if I change this to, you know, like 2/28/2021, that would change the sprint echo because it fits there, for example. And then finally, for the prestige part of it, to make your data memorable, is use graphics to represent your data. You know, a picture tells 1,000 words, so does charts and graphs. And spreadsheets, especially Google spreadsheets, makes it easy to add graphs into your presentation. Think about what data you want to represent visually. Can really ease how you manage that. So pick data that's straightforward and easy to represent, such as here we have the ticket priority levels and a sum of the count of all the tickets that have that priority. So I can highlight this range, and I can go up here and click the insert chart. And on Google Spreadsheets will at least try to estimate what type of chart they think would work well for me. But I could change this to, you know, a pie chart, or let's do like a 3D chart, and I can customize this. And this, you know, for like a client, someone who wants just a quick visualization of the data, this is really helpful. So we can see the team spends a lot of time on trivial tickets. So we may want to think about what we actually enter into our sprints. Downside of graphics and charts, they can't be hidden or grouped. So if I close this group here, you still see the chart here. It says no data because by default, they won't include hidden data. I can just click the little button to say, yes, include the data that's hidden, but I can't hide this, unfortunately. So let's take a look at a more complex example at our summary sheet. So this is what I would provide as a sprint summary, for example, or a team velocity summary, whatever you want to call it. So I have from my sprint sheet, just the averages of data. I have from my ticket sheet and my team sheets, I have like a sprint velocity based on the amount of tickets that are completed per sprint. I can see tickets assignments versus ticket completed, percentage of ticket priority. So this gives me a lot of information that even if I didn't want to be someone to come in here and look at all the nitty gritty, I might come here every 2 weeks and look at how that's changing for sprints. I might be able to, use this ticket estimator to figure out, well, based on the tickets that aren't assigned yet, when can we think about moving them in to the sprint? So with that being said, where am I? Here we go. I think that's just like all magic tricks. When you reveal the secrets, there's not much to it. Really making your spreadsheets magical and useful is about these simple things. It's about understanding your audience. It's about building a structure that makes the data look familiar. It's about putting in dynamic data and using dynamic values where you can and referencing data where you can. And it's about making your data memorable by highlighting important information, by throwing in charts and graphs where you can, and really about thinking about how your data can be used to tell a meaningful story to deliver value to somebody in some way. And with that, that's all I have for this, and I will have time for questions. Again, if you want a copy of this spreadsheet, just go to this link, bit.ly nerds21magic. It's view only, but if you make your own copy, then you'll have access to view all the functions and features that are in it, and check out the example like sprint tracker that I have. Google has a link here that lists out all the different functions you can use in their spreadsheets. Like you can even call up Google Translate and translate text in a spreadsheet, which is pretty cool. So you can find that there. If you want to know anything more or have any questions or comments about spreadsheets or this presentation, it's my first time presenting this presentation, please reach out, let me know. I appreciate it. So there's something in chat, let's see. Just a good job, Mike. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Someone asked, mobile lookup on Google Sheets, any tips? Yes, I use my phone a lot, and I have a lot of personal spreadsheets, and I access them on my mobile phone a lot. That's, I think, the tip there. The number one tip is about deleting the columns and rows that you don't need. So for example, I'll go to the sprint log, for example. This would load very well on a mobile device because it's only a little bit of data. If I had like columns D through Z, then it makes it harder for me to navigate on my phone because all of a sudden I'm sliding through the different columns when I don't need to. So I think by just paring down and keeping only the rows you need, and then clicking add row or duplicate row or insert row below when you need to, that really helps the mobile experience when you can condense it down. Maybe even think about your audience there and create a mobile summary sheet, something that's a little more condensed that you can use on mobile devices.
Could I follow up, Mike? That was my question.
Yes.
So my question is actually, I love Google Sheets, and I've got sort of a public sheet that does a lookup. So people have to be able to pull a drop down to do a lookup on a hidden sheet. Mm-hmm. But the drop down doesn't work on mobile because it, for whatever reason, if they don't have the Google Sheet app, it won't allow them to actually do the drop down. Do you run into that, or is there a way around it in Google Sheets that I could get to work?
Interesting question. So like if they're viewing it not using like the Google Sheets app?
Correct.
I don't know. I'm going to be honest. I don't know the answer to that. I've never run into that situation that I've had to navigate through. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
That's okay. Thanks for trying.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? They want to see any other magic or the under the hood stuff? If I turn off my conditional formatting, this presentation looks horrible, but it just gets rid of all the data or all the styling, I should say. So again, please copy this. Feel free to look at this example spreadsheet for sprint summaries, and I call it, a sprint tracker. Just I tried to throw in everything I know about Google Sheets into this so that you could see how things are done. Great. I'm going to turn on my conditional styling again.
That was great. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank